Everyone, we are so excited to be here. I'm just going to do a quick introduction so that you know who we are personally. I know that you guys already know that we're from Valve on the Steam team, but my name's Kaci, and I work in communications. Internally and externally, and quite a bit for the Steam team. We've been super interested to be collecting some of your questions ahead of time, and we're going to dive into some of those, but then obviously make sure you enter in any questions that come up as we go. We'll get to as many as we possibly can. We're really excited to kind of give you a bit of an overview of how Steam works to start before we get into some of your questions, though. So I'll let my amazing colleagues introduce themselves, and then we will go ahead and get started.
I'll go first. My name's Tom Giardino. I work on the business team here at Valve. Thanks for joining this session, by the way. This is probably the third or fourth DevGAMM event that I've participated in over the years, and we always really appreciate getting a chance to be here. So thanks again to the event hosts. My job on the Steam business team is kind of focused on being a bridge between PC game developers and the development and design teams here at Valve, and then customers accessing games on the storefront. So that involves a bunch of really interesting work. Some of it is sort of day-to-day operational things like, oh my gosh, the Steam autumn sale starts in 5 minutes and I didn't get my discount submitted. Can somebody help me? That sort of just day-to-day helping game developers do what they need to do on Steam. But kind of the more interesting long-term work is around strategically thinking about, hey, we keep hearing from indie devs at conferences or a AAA publisher who wants to try something new that Steam is missing a feature or missing a tool. And how can we design something that meets the needs of our external development parties, game devs like yourselves, but is also kind of positive and useful for customers and meets them where they are. So that's been really fun. Over the years, I've gotten to work on all sorts of things like Steam Dev Days or Steam playtesting or different features and tools. I'm not a developer or a designer, so my job is often to sort of advocate for, hey, here's what developers are telling us they want and need, and then think about it from the customer side at the other end of, okay, now how do we put this in front of an end user in a way that's valuable to them? So that's kind of what my world revolves around at Valve. Alden?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Alden, and I'm a designer at Valve. And my role primarily involves designing and developing new features for Steam. It's working with the development teams and designing kind of the customer experience, the user interface. And that involves a lot of the Steam client, the Steam store, and also the backend publishing tools that you all use as you prepare your games for release on Steam. And many of the Steamworks features that you might be integrating with your game. So I know a lot of these features pretty well because I've helped design them and iterate on them and listen to bug reports and figure out how to fix them. So I can go into pretty great depth on kind of how some of these things work, what our philosophy is behind the design of some of them, and why we even set out to design or build such features. And I really enjoy these kinds of sessions to hear what kind of questions you all have, and that really helps us prioritize what we work on next, what kind of features we build, and be able to understand why they're important to you as game developers in communicating with your audience or running your business or just helping you run your game the best that you can.
Awesome. Every time we introduce ourselves, I'm always excited to hear more about my coworkers because we all have been working together so long, we forget how amazing they all are. It's kind of cool. Well, as we mentioned at the top, we're really going to get to as many of your questions as possible, but we always like to start with a little bit of an overview of Steam and how it works and some best practices. And Tom was going to kind of get us started with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that we noticed when thanks for submitting questions in advance, by the way. It kind of helps us get a sense of all the different topics that are interesting to you. And we've always found it really useful to just talk through some of the fundamentals of the platform and the store to set the tone for that. So one of the things that is a big priority for us is building long-term relationships with players. And that informs a bunch of the decisions that we make. So it's not just about how do we make the most money selling games this quarter. It's not about our own products, Dota or Counter-Strike or Half-Life Alyx. It's about, hey, we want to build a space that customers come back to over years and years of time to play games, connect with their friends, interact with games in ways that they might not have expected, or that can really surprise and delight them. The other side of that coin is all of you game devs. We need to figure out a way that whether you're a really small studio with 1 or 2 employees making your very first game, or you're EA or Activision or Xbox, you can access this platform in a meaningful way. Put your game up, find customers, integrate with tools. So we've worked really hard to make sure that from the technical perspective, the features and APIs and implementations are really amazingly democratic. So, we built out this big inventory system for Counter-Strike and Team Fortress, our own games. And the first questions we asked were, okay, how do we make that a Steam feature so that any game in the world, no matter how many resources they have, can go use that for free? And that's helped a really broad set of games and developers connect with their audience, find success. Unlike a lot of other stores, our storefront does not have any sort of editorial or like deal making aspect to it. So it's not always obvious to people, but we don't sell any advertising on Steam. As much as some parties would love to buy ads to pin their game to the front page of Steam, we only market games in that sort of direct way based on customer data, like users and wish lists and revenue. We don't sell ads, and we don't have an editorial team making preference choices. So this can be really different if you've worked through this process with other platforms, where there might be a Latin America editor who, if he or she likes your game, then you're going to show up on their store in Brazil. And if they don't like your game, then maybe you won't. On Steam, things like the top sellers list, popular new releases, those are regionalized. So if you have a bunch of happy customers in Brazil, you show up more in Brazil. There's no regional team or editor that you have to impress. So we found that it just makes more sense for customers if we don't assume, oh, Valve knows best. Valve has the best taste, because there's a lot of games and experiences that, we don't even know they exist. And then suddenly they're a top played game on Steam. And that to us is the platform working as intended. The only other thing I want to touch on here is personalization. I think there's a lot of questions of, how do I get on the front page of Steam? And the reality is the front page of Steam actually looks really different for me or for Kaci or for Alden, based on who we're friends with, what games we play. It looks different based on what language you speak and what country you're in. And so we try to build a storefront that, if a brand new game just came out and it's a global top seller and it's relevant to, a ton of people, a lot of people are going to see that game. But we also curate and personalize it for each user based on the games you play, what's on your wish list, who you follow. You can follow curators who recommend games and developers and publishers who make games. What's selling well, what's new, which older games have just shipped a major update. And Alden and another web developer here at Valve actually made a YouTube video, which I think we can probably paste into the chat, which goes through, it's got to be 45 minutes long. Alden, you can talk more about it if you want. It's really like, hey, what is this little section of Steam, and why does it exist, and what's its goal, et cetera. So that's a really useful resource after this talk. If you just want to learn more about like, how is Valve thinking about the storefront, that's a great window into a bunch of our decisions.
We got a couple of really great questions in the chat, and we've been dropping some links there. So as we're talking about things that might have a little bit more nuance to them, feel free to check the chat. It might be a lot easier to follow along, or even click on it and save it for later so you can get a little bit more insight. So Maria in chat asked about Steam festivals like Next Fest as a great way to promote games, and wondering if we see them as a good thing and if we're going to continue to feature them. Our plan right now is to continue to feature them. We found that we get a lot of really great feedback from developers as far as their ability to use, especially Steam Next Fest, to build an audience ahead of their game launch. We've also gotten some great feedback from players who really enjoy the opportunity to explore demos for free and be a part of that. Alden and Tom, if you don't mind, I feel like it's a good opportunity to dive into the communications question we got based on that. You guys cool with that?
Yeah,
Are you
go
not?
for it.
Yeah,
I just realized I minimized my window and you were probably nodding.
No, go for it.
Sure. Yeah. So Steam Next Fest brings us to a question that we got ahead of time, and I kind of want to try to fold them into each other because they do relate. The question we got ahead of time was, if you wanted to develop the best possible game and you had all the money in the world, you would still probably not invest any in marketing because you'd have so much else to invest in with the game development process. So how can a game be successful on Steam without investing in marketing? So we get this question in a lot of different ways, and understandably so. We've touched on this already, but even when it comes to things like communication and marketing, Steam is not built and Steamworks is not built as something that tells you, here's what works for marketing and you better do it. And if you don't, good luck to you. It's really all about offering a variety of tools that as developers you can choose among to use based on the way that you want to communicate about your game, the way that you want to connect with players and build your audience. Because that can be different depending on the genre, depending on the development team. There may be a lot of you, and that might make more sense to do some bigger, broader events. There might just be a couple of you or just one of you. And because of that, it might be easier to do some more underground marketing. For example, we've had a lot of developers that use the development process itself as communications beats through Steamworks. So they'll involve the players in the process by sharing a blog post or sharing a news event, and even pairing it with Twitter and having people interact with them that way. So there's no one right way to build an audience and to create an audience. Some other examples of things you can do: you can host live streams directly on your page, on your store page. Alpha and beta testing, those offer a great chance for you to collect feedback early and often, but it also, again, provides an excuse for you to communicate. So you can use different tools in Steamworks to communicate throughout that testing process. Curator Connect is another tool with Steamworks that lets you connect with streamers and influencers and folks who are already set up as curators on Steam. And then you can share builds of your game through that with some of these folks who have audiences themselves. And then Steam Next Fest, which gets back to that question. That's a really great example of how you can build an audience. With Steam Next Fest, for those of you who may not be super familiar, it's an event that we host right now 3 times a year. The next one's coming up in February. And the goal is to, through our platform, host a space for hundreds of upcoming demos from games soon to be released on Steam so that players from around the world can test them out for free. They can participate in live streams that the developers do. Developers can do live chats. So it's a really great way to start building a community and connecting with a broader global community. And we have heard from developers that they have really seen a huge increase, not just in necessarily wish list numbers or anything like that, but really in their ability to kind of build a back and forth process on development. And so players give them feedback like, hey, in the demo, I really enjoyed this, or this part was really difficult. And so it gives the developers the chance to fix those or look into them or try something different before release. And so that's coming up in February. Let me see if we have, I'm going to minimize my window. Oh, good. Alden just posted a link in chat so you can kind of get in there and see more about that. And then finally, piece of advice that we always like to give developers is to think about your perspective as a player. Obviously, you're developers, but you're still gamers at heart, right? So really thinking about your own experience as a gamer and what are some new games that you have been drawn to and what drew you to them? What made you want to play them? What made you want to engage with those developers? What made you want to be a part of that process? And really thinking about that in terms of what might work for your game and what you'd like to do when you're considering some of these. I always say marketing in quotes because marketing sounds like super glossy and important, but we really believe it's less about that and more about finding unique and genuine ways to connect and build with your audience.
And I think that's a really great point, Kaci. Sometimes marketing feels like immediately people think that only means buying advertisement or spending money. And the reality is, as you look at some of the top played games on Steam, every one of them has a different approach to marketing and what that means to them. You know, for some of these games, they have no traditional marketing whatsoever. They've just built a community elsewhere and brought that community with them to Steam. Others are, you know, the super traditional AAA release where there might be a billboard up and, you know, magazine ads and web ads and the whole 9 yards. Marketing isn't, you know, just one of those things or another. One quick question that Maria passed along was about cross promotion. How to reach players and tell them, hey, I've got a sequel or another game in my franchise is coming out. There's a couple of tools in particular that we built. One of them is built around you, the creator. We sort of call these creator homepages. And this is what it sounds like, a landing page for your brand. That could be a publishing house. It could be an individual dev studio. It could even be a franchise with a specific IP. You build a homepage for that you know, idea, that brand, drop all the relevant games onto the page, and then customers can follow it. And this is, you know, a thing that I think it can be a little bit overwhelming to start small on this. If you only have one game right now, it can feel a little silly to make a developer homepage that just has your one game on it. But as you make announcements, as you make, you know, future products, it's really an investment in your own long-term growth. In the same way that, you know, making a YouTube channel or a Twitter handle is the same thing. You're not going to have 1 million followers right away. But if you're in this in the long term and you're building sequels or you have another game coming out a year and a half later, you have to start somewhere. And the sooner, you know, the sooner you let that snowball start rolling downhill and gaining momentum, the better. So we'll share some links to the creator homepages. The other thing that we've just added recently, Steam has this concept of bundles. Those have actually existed for a while. This sort of complete the set loyalty bundle where, oh, there's 4 games and I already own 3 of them, and you know, I can upgrade and get the 4th at a discount, or I can buy all 4 of those games in one go if I'm brand new and I'm really excited. We've also just enabled an aspect of that called collaborative bundles, which means if I'm at one publisher and Kaci is at another and Alden is at a third, we can all directly within Steamworks say, hey, we want to cooperate. We all make similar games. We think we could benefit from cross-pollination. I'll set up the bundle. I'll invite Kaci and Alden to join. They can approve if they're comfortable with it or not, if they don't want their game to be sold that way. So in that way, you can team up with other studios and other franchises to build collaborative bundles. When a customer buys that product, all of you are still getting paid for your individual product. So it's not you're not entering into a business deal with these people. Somebody who buys a copy of your game is still, you know, the royalties and revenue share are the same for you, but it's a way to team up as a group if you wish to do so. I know there's probably a couple other good questions in chat, but I wonder if we, Alden and Kaci, if you feel strongly, if we should work through some of the pre-asked ones or.
Yeah, actually, I just wanted to elaborate a little bit on one of the points you were making about developer homepages and just more concretely describe what happens when somebody follows you as a developer and you release your next game. We send an email to that person. So they don't necessarily need to wish list your new game, but by the act of following you as a developer, we will automatically send them an email when your new game comes out. And even if they don't follow you, there is a special section on the homepage of the Steam store where your new games will show up to people that have played your past games. So it is important that you set that up early and get that established, and that will just help you over the long run, like Tom was describing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think I left out the most meaningful thing, which is, you know, if I follow you today and you release a new game in 2023, I'm going to find out about that game, even if I, you know, hadn't heard of it prior. That's really valuable. I think I might actually move forward on one of the questions that was asked in advance. Somebody referenced a book by a game developer, Jesse Schell, who some of us at Valve have had the opportunity to talk with and work with over the years as well. Is really thinking about building a strong community and having experts in your game community. So giving somebody who's a game expert an opportunity and even an encouragement to teach new players and show new players, especially for online games. And this is a really interesting topic for us. We could probably have a 2-hour session just on this. We've experimented in it with our own games. In Dota 2, for instance, we rolled out a coaching feature where I could be looking over the shoulder of another player and giving them guidance, even if I wasn't actively playing. And there were some sort of organic rewards and incentives for doing that. We think about this similar to user-generated content. So a lot of times people think about UGC as mods or building a map for a game or playable in-game content. But really, UGC is kind of the entire world around your game. It could be concept art that people do. It could be cosplay, that they're wearing to a convention. It could be really any of these things, including being a really good teacher about the game or writing a really good guide. Super helpful people in your Discord server who are just always there answering questions. All of that is, you can think of through the same lens of UGC. And for some games, you might actually get value from incentivizing that process somehow. Depending on the product, this isn't going to be true for all games. It may be that creating really good guides or being a coach in a multiplayer game, especially if you have collaborative, co-op experiences, you can build in systems to your game to directly reward that. One of the reasons we don't have a Steamworks specific feature within games is because how that looks is so different. We don't even have a unified feature for something like that across our own games, because what's right for Left 4 Dead is different from Counter-Strike, is different from, Dota and so on. So in-game programs like coaching or Overwatch to, review cheat reports and evaluate them, all those fall under the same umbrella of amplifying experts in your game community. We did a Steamworks virtual conference relatively recently, and all the videos are available on demand, I think on Steam, but certainly on YouTube as well. And one theme that came up in that virtual conference, it was really all about community and communication. And a developer from a smaller studio, Rose City, really talked about how they put player input, front and center. I believe they participated in a Next Fest. They got a bunch of data from it, from people using their demo. They asked questions. They did a survey afterward. And then they recycled that back out as an announcement to their community and saying, hey, thank you so much. We learned so much from you folks who were early adopters and jumped into the game early. And here's how we're changing our game as a result. Those folks, might not technically be experts because the game's unreleased, and how expert could anybody be? But the concept is the same. These really invested users who want to be involved in your game development process and want to help you grow your community, put them up on a pedestal, elevate them, even if it's completely free stuff like running a survey and sharing the results and thanking them. That's enough to start building a community, even if it's not a feature that you've designed into your gameplay or into your mechanics. And the last thing, that we use at Valve to sort of evaluate that work, one of the questions we ask is, are there people in our community stepping in to answer questions or defend a decision we made? We think that's a really good way for you to figure out, are these efforts even working? Is it helping? So if somebody asks a question in your Discord, is it always you who has to answer it? Or is there another community member who's like, oh, they talked about that, in their first dev blog a couple weeks ago, here's the link. Once you start seeing things like that happen in your community, that you're finding success. That actually community members are building the community themselves. It's not just you, all alone trying to build it. I hope that's a useful background. I know that level of user-generated content isn't always what people think of with UGC relating to mods and other stuff, but it's just as important to build your game community.
Mm-hmm. I love the talking about like what Tom just said about community members jumping in and kind of explaining things on your behalf, because it reminds me of being in school and you're in an argument with somebody and you're like, ugh, and then a friend comes up and they're like, I got this. Don't you worry. Because then the message is actually even more easily received by everybody else, because it's like, oh, I'm not hearing it from the developer, I'm hearing it from somebody else, so it must be true, like, because they're both saying it. So we find that to be a really good measurement, like Tom said. We have a couple more questions in advance that we're going to get to, but we got one in chat that I know Alden wanted to address about organizing events. So if you wanted to get to that, Alden, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, so the question was, if somebody wanted to organize an event like those from games from Quebec or Swiss games, how much in advance do I need to approach you? So I'll talk a little bit about kind of how we've been thinking about these. More and more, there's been sort of regional groups of game developers that have come together and are interested in shining a light on the games made in a certain region. And those can be really interesting to customers, depending on kind of the set of games, how big it is, how popular new the games are. We think those are interesting in general. I think it's nice to remind players that their games are made by human beings somewhere in the world, and that there's other places around the world that are different from them, and their favorite game may come from some place that they've never been to and is really interesting. And so we appreciate and we enjoy kind of taking the opportunity to shine a light on different regions and where game development is happening. And so we've been, helping and working with different kind of game developer associations, typically, to put together these kind of these sales that focus on different regions like Quebec or Swiss or France or things like that. And if you're interested in putting something like that together, we would be happy for you to send us a proposal. We would like probably 3 months ahead of time. There's a lot that kind of goes into organizing it, finding space on our promotional calendar, if that's a good fit. And you as an organizer, just kind of pulling together all the games that are made in that region and making sure that you're feeling like you've got a pretty good comprehensive collection of those. So, and the other thing that we're looking for those kinds of regional sales is what is really the call to action to customers. If the sale ends up being, made in a certain state within your country, and it's a really small set of games, and they're all kind of brand new and nobody's ever heard of them, it's going to be a really hard thing to ask a bunch of customers to come in and get excited about that. If you can have a few kind of big titles that people have heard about, that can be a great entry point for customers to understand kind of the context around that region and understand, what's happening that's really exciting in that region. And then that can help shine a light on the other games that are also being made in that region. So I guess the short answer to the question is probably 3 months or so would be a good amount of time ahead of time to start this conversation. Generally, the more lead time, the better. But I think that's generally a good rough approximation.
One thing I just want to add there that I've seen kind of becoming more common over the last 6 or 9 months, because we've promoted a lot of these, we get that question of like, hey, I want to make a game developers from Seattle sale. Like, how do I start? And I think it's really important if you do want to invest in that work, don't start with the question, how do I get Valve to promote my sale? Because that's actually not an interesting question for us. We're thinking about customers. We're thinking about end users. So the events that have seemed to really matter to players and been really engaging have been ones where there's already some reason to exist for this event. Jeff Keighley's The Game Awards is the extreme example of this, where it's this huge, well-produced event, and Jeff said, boy, what if we put this on Steam too? That would be a cool way to expand it. Now, building the Game Awards is, a 20-year process that we don't expect an indie dev to just magically be able to do, but it's the right framework. You kind of need to think, hey, what's an event or a conference or an expo or an activity that customers really care about and are engaged in that you would just want to build anyway? Imagine that there was no Steam promotion involved. Would there be any reason for this event to exist? Because that's what really moves the needle, not just for people deciding, oh, hey, should we help support this event here at Valve, but for the end users. What is the point of this event, and why does it exist? Because I think if you invent it just to try to, promote a sale, that's actually a lot less compelling. There's tons of sales happening all the time. Games go on discount all the time. The more interesting thing is, oh, what's a reason for a community to gather and share an experience together? So that can be a useful starting point rather than just like, hey, how do I get a sale page made?
And to even just take that a step further, it reminds me a little bit of the same answer that we give to a different question, which is we often get developers say like, what genre should I make? Like, what's popular? Like, how do I capitalize on whatever is popular? What trends are you seeing before I develop the game? And it's a very similar feel to the answer we just gave for creating an event, which is rather than start with the end result of like, how do I get a bunch of people on my game? Start with, what kind of game do I want to make? And what are my goals with that game, and go with that. It's always better to go with what you know and what feels genuine to you from the time you choose to develop a game all the way up through the events you choose to have. It's kind of a theme that we see that is successful for developers.
Yeah, and all the way along thinking about your game as a product and what is the unique aspect of your game that customers are going to be excited about, what makes it stand out and differentiated from other games, and how can you amplify that in all of your communication with customers. And that's actually a really good segue into one of the questions that we got ahead of time for this session, which is, what are some of the most common mistakes that developers make when shipping a game on Steam? Really, there's a couple of things that stand out in our mind when people ask us that question. One of the key things is we see the mistake of developers not putting up a store page very early in the process. There's some games that come out and it seems like putting their page up on Steam was almost an afterthought. They got all the way through game development and thought, oh, well, maybe I should ship on Steam. Let's put up a store page and ship it. I think in the process, you've missed a huge opportunity to start building awareness among customers that your game even exists. And so one of the things that you can do that will really give you a big head start throughout development and as you lead towards release is putting up a store page on Steam. You can point people there anytime you talk to customers, you find customers, say, go wishlist my game. Steam will make sure that you get notified when it comes out. That's a great way to just be gathering up all of that interest. And also as a practice for how you communicate about your game. The store page can be a great place to iterate on the language that you use in describing your game, practicing, what does your artwork look like? How do you make sure that that is compelling and engaging, trying out some different things over time and seeing what works better and what doesn't work as well. So time is your friend there. And that gives you also a place to talk to your customers as you're developing and make sure you're not just developing in a silo without any feedback from anybody. I guess that kind of feeds into my second bullet point, which I already covered, which is just spending the time and energy to make sure that players exist. Players know that your game exists. And, Kaci talked about some of that, the ways and the tools and features that you can do that on Steam. And then also just remembering that people learn about your games in all sorts of places. And so thinking about, broadly speaking, where else on the internet can you make sure that players are aware that your game exists and is coming? Another mistake that we see game developers make is shipping a game that only supports a single language. The most common instance of this is, hey, I know English, I can ship my game in English, let's do that. And really, that's cutting off a huge portion of the global audience from having access to your game. So it's really important that you think carefully about translating your game into other languages. And there's a couple of ways that you can go about kind of figuring out the right way to do that. One thing that we've seen developers do is simply translating the text on their store page into different languages. And that means that when people come from other countries or that speak primarily other languages, that they can understand what your game is about. And then they can make an informed decision about whether that seems interesting to them or not. In our backend reporting tools, you can see what countries people are wishlisting your game from. So you can use that as a rough proxy for languages that they might speak. There are a few countries or a few areas that primarily seem to have a little bit more importance for translating into if you have a lot of customer interest from those countries. In particular, that would be Japan and Korea and China and Turkey and kind of a lot of Eastern Asian countries where a lot of the player population doesn't necessarily speak English as a second language. If you're trying to reach a lot of Italians or Germans or French, you might find that you can reach actually a significant portion of those population simply by having your game available in English, just because there is a lot of players in those countries that speak English as a second language. Though if you're making a simulation game, a large portion of your population for your player base is probably going to be in Germany. You might want to translate into German. So it's really looking around and look at the other games on Steam that are really similar to yours and look at what languages they support. Look through some of the customer reviews, and you can sort by different languages and kind of get a sense for, where are those players that are playing that kind of game.
The
And
only other
then,
thing,
yeah, go ahead.
Alden, I'm gonna add one thing there. If folks are curious, just hey, on Steam in general, what languages are the most popular? We actually share that data monthly as part of our Steam hardware survey. This is a public website. You don't even need to be a Steamworks partner to see it. It breaks down operating system and graphics cards and so many other details. But one of them is the primary language of the user. So you can see in ranked order, here are the most popular languages. That's not the only consideration. Alden's more nuanced take is really important. But if you just want to know, hey, what are the language breakdowns on Steam right now? That's an easy way to find out.
Oh, that's great. Tom, do you want to drop that link into chat?
Yeah, I
If you
will.
can
I'll
dig
grab
that up. Great. Yeah, and we also ahead of time had a really similar question. Somebody was really interested in knowing if we've ever analyzed the worst selling games on Steam, and is there something common that unites those games? Are they in a specific genre? We haven't done a very thorough analysis on what the most poor performing games on Steam, but really I think the short answer is almost certainly they've done the set of mistakes that I just outlined in answering the previous question. And we see games that put up a store page, the bare minimum 2 weeks before they ship. Nobody knows that their game exists. It's English only game. It has the minimum of 5 screenshots and kind of a trailer that's half put together. That's not setting that game up for great success. There's a lot of those things that you could be putting a little bit more energy into and polishing and giving yourself more time in building awareness and building your audience that will just help you enormously over the long run of your game.
Yeah, I feel like my experience with this, as one of the folks who is answering emails or requests that come in through our developer help form, folks will literally ask, hey, it's been 10 days after release. I'm not selling well at all. What am I doing wrong? What's going on? You can almost feel like, all right, before I even load this store page, probably going to be a single player only game with no features added, so no Steam achievements or controller support or other things like that. And whatever the bare minimum of requirements is, like Alden said, that's always like my prediction. And that's not a knock on game devs because this is unbelievably hard. It's harder than writing a book. It's harder than getting up on stage and performing something. Building a game is such a huge challenge. So I certainly don't want to belittle or demean that in any way. And you might spend years on it and then realize, oh, wow, yeah, I don't have any presence for this game on Twitter or social media or Steam. So there's no easy path towards success, and you could do everything right. You could take, all of our advice and plan really well and support tons of languages and have the best feature support ever and still struggle to find an audience. So there's the challenge, that we always talk about, especially with something like localization. Localizing into a bunch of languages doesn't guarantee that you'll sell well. But if your product and your plan is built around commercial broad success, if you want to, make $1 million selling your game, you'll almost certainly need to support, additional languages. And that's the only other thing I want to add here is we think Steam is a platform that a game developer can interact with on their own terms. So if making $1 million selling your game is not an interesting goal, and you just want to release, free mini games every few months, that's fantastic. That makes Steam better. There's customers out there who are interested in that. There's no expectation or requirement that commercial revenue success is the only valid, reason for a game to exist on Steam. But frequently that is a thing that people are thinking about is, hey, even if that's not my only goal, how do I optimize for earning more revenue? And at that point, you do have to treat it as a business and as a product. I mean, games are art and they're entertainment and they're really special, but you have to put yourself in the customer's shoes and say, hey, what are the other options? Somebody can go download Roblox for free and have thousands of hours of amazing experiences without even having a Steam account or spending a penny. In a universe where that's true, how do I compete? What do I need to build and how do I need to connect with people that they would even bother to, spend time or money with my game when there's so many great options out there? And through that lens, I think that'll help people, play to their strengths and figure out what am I bringing to the table? What unique story can I tell? What amazing creative gameplay mechanic can I provide? Instead of just saying, well, I'm going to make the game and put it out, and I hope it does well, because there's so much competition that's a really daunting, path to go down. And it may mean that you make a different type of game, or you talk about your game differently if commercial, success and revenue is your primary goal.
Great. So keep the questions coming. We have about 15 minutes left, or wait, no, let me look at the timer, 10 minutes left. So definitely feel free to keep asking us any questions, but just to get back a little bit to some of the ones we received ahead of time. We had a really interesting question about how sales were or weren't affected, or any impacts we did or didn't see with the pandemic, especially when it came to different regions. And I know Tom was going to address a little bit of that.
Yeah, this is a super interesting topic for us. I think the specific question was really, hey, regions and growth. Did the pandemic change the landscape of Steam? And the really short answer is it didn't really change the landscape, but it did seem to accelerate things. So if you look at some of our public data around, Steam player numbers or the revenue data we've shared at conferences in the past, it's a pretty obvious and consistent trend, right? Steam is growing. There are bigger spikes and smaller drop-offs over time, but the trend is pretty consistent. What COVID seemed to do is move that entire trend line up and then kind of continue where it left off. And that was really hard for us to predict. When the pandemic first began, when school and work, were kind of canceled and more people were spending time at home, we saw this unbelievable, rocket ship spike of users and revenue. And the question we all asked was, well, when does that rocket come crashing back down to the ground? Is it in 2 weeks? Is it in a month? And what ended up happening is it kind of never did. The new baseline for users on Steam is just significantly higher than it was. I think we're at now, the normal peak concurrent users is something in the range of like 26 million. And if you looked back at 2018 or 2019, those numbers were dramatically lower, 16 million or 20 million. The one thing regionally that's most interesting is that not all the regions are growing at the same rate. In the time span of, let's just say 2010 to 2015, a ton of Steam's growth came from North America and Western Europe, and also Russia. Those were the areas where PC gaming was already the most popular, where broadband internet and downloading a 25 gigabyte game was feasible, and they were also the areas that we supported the best in terms of language and currency and payment methods. But in 2015, 2016 timeframe, we invested really heavily in regional language and currency and payment method support. So that's when, Japanese yen was first added, and Korean won, and so on and so forth, to the point now that I think we have something like 40 currencies supported on Steam. And that really helped the newer markets, which had previously been very small, grow dramatically. So look, North America and Western Europe are still growing. Revenue, both, year over year, comparing this year to last year, which was kind of the anomalous huge COVID spike, we're still growing and up considerably, even in North America and Western Europe. But in some of those newer territories, some of the ones I was looking at most recently are kind of Middle East and North Africa. So Kuwait and Egypt and Saudi Arabia, territories where currency support is relatively new and PC gaming has a much shorter history. Those territories are growing kind of tremendously. So the faster growth is coming from those newer markets. I think Latin America is the other big hotspot for us. Regions like Colombia, where broadband internet and access to PC gaming hardware was, almost non-existent 10 years ago. Those are now, growing and exciting markets that will continue to expand. The other nice thing about the PC space is Steam itself is global. So there's not an aspect limited by Valve's own hardware manufacturing or hardware distribution. that limits things, and not to knock Sony and Microsoft and Nintendo. We love and work with all of those folks. But at the end of the day, your Switch region sales are going to be limited to what countries Nintendo is able to support. Whereas anybody can, open a laptop from 5 years ago that's running Windows or Mac or Linux and download the Steam client and buy a game. Valve doesn't necessarily need to proactively support that region with hardware. And that's opened a bunch of opportunities in Latin America, in the Middle East, and now in Africa, where territories that we really have almost no support, like Nigeria. We don't support the currency. We don't have, CDN network infrastructure there. But those regions are growing because people can open up a laptop or a desktop PC and access Steam. So the next 5 years is going to be really interesting in terms of growth. I hope that's a useful summary. The takeaway for you as game developers is, to harken back to what Alden said, that localization is just going to become more and more important as the pieces of the pie that go to English, French, German, Russian, Chinese. The user numbers in those areas are going to keep growing, but there's more and more being added to the pie every day that you'll need to start thinking about if that sort of broad commercial reach is a goal for your game.
There was a related question that also came in ahead of time that was about genres and whether we have seen any change in kind of audience preference during the pandemic. Are people playing different kinds of games? I think you wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, this was another really fun one. So there's some really obvious anomalies, right? Among Us, Fall Guys, these games that, like, in the case of Among Us, it had been out for years and it kind of benefited in a unique way from folks being at home and looking for connected gameplay experiences that they can share with their friends. So I don't want to say the pandemic has had no impact, because there are a handful of those titles where, because of their nature and because of their ability to provide kind of social shared experiences, I think they were helped. However, should you go out and build a 100-person battle royale race game because Fall Guys was popular a couple of years ago? Definitely not. If that's the game you want to build and that you're capable of building, that's great. I think there's tons of space for that in the market. But chasing those style of experiences probably makes less sense. There's a handful of exceptions that are also regional. So there are certain games on Steam that only support Turkish and are from a Turkish game developer, and they've got a ton of players in Turkey, and they have no players anywhere else. There's some other examples of that, country to country, language to language, or edge cases where just the content is really popular. So Football Manager and FIFA are good examples where, like, they're both soccer games, football games, but the regions that they're popular in are very different just because of the way that you interact with soccer. As a platform, we've deliberately tried to avoid incentivizing any specific genre or mechanic. Kaci talked about this a little bit earlier. The big concern for us is, we don't want people to feel like, oh, Valve made a Half-Life VR game, so making VR games is the right choice. Everyone should make a VR game. Valve will only promote you if you make a VR game. It's cool that we're invested in VR and we're big believers in it, but we think you should make the game that you can make really well and that will delight customers. So we don't want to put our finger on the scale and tell people what mechanic to use or what feature to take advantage of. We want to make those available to you as sort of a menu, and you're choosing from that, okay, I have the right skills and creativity and team to build a really awesome Metroidvania platformer. There's a bunch of those on Steam. They sell really well, but we don't want to tell people to go make those just because we're building Steam Deck, if that makes sense.
We just had a great question come in through chat that Alden wanted to answer. Do you plan to update local currency prices compared to USD, as they sometimes feel not really up to date?
Yeah, so this is one of the areas where we provide a service as you're filling out the forms to get your game set up. We have done a bunch of research to figure out what are reasonable local prices in different countries around the world in different currencies, So you will enter in your like a USD price, and then Steam will recommend, hey, these are good, reasonable conversions of that price. And they're not direct exchange rates. They're based on kind of the local purchasing power of customers in those countries. And one of the things that can happen over time is there can be significant economic events in certain countries that cause their currency to inflate or deflate. And so over time, those things might get a little bit out of whack. The challenge really there is that those customers didn't suddenly end up with a bunch more money that they can spend on games. They're just because the currency has inflated in value. So we're really delicate and really cautious when making adjustments like that, because sometimes a currency can also swing broadly upwards in value and then suddenly back down to where it was before. And if we're always chasing that, then it's going to be really hard for customers in that country as games suddenly, I mean, if they were, it's like suddenly games get more expensive and then cheaper and then more expensive and cheaper. And it's going to be really hard for players to follow that. So we do make adjustments from time to time, and we're always keeping an eye on that. But we're not quick to rush in and make adjustments, because a lot of those swings in the valuation of currencies are not permanent and not long ranged.
Yeah, the other thing that is really interesting about this is there's just a bunch of factors that we can't predict for or plan for that well. One of these is just the way that countries levy sales tax or VAT. We in euro pricing, VAT is factored into the price. So if you see a 40 euro price, you will spend exactly 40 euros. And then on the back end, we're going to subtract some of that out and remit it to the tax authorities. And the developer is going to, get the piece that remains after tax. Whereas in the United States and lots of other countries, if the price says $40, well, the actual price you're going to pay is $40 times whatever the local tax rate is. And so the way that those taxes get levied on online purchases and when they get added is not consistent globally, and is really hard for us to predict. So there are a set of currencies where even regardless of Forex rates, we want to make adjustments over time because, hey, they used to charge VAT and now they don't, or vice versa. There's a handful of folks here at Valve working on making some adjustments to our recommended pricing. The one thing that I think is obvious from what Alden said, but I always work to reiterate, number one, these suggestions are just that, suggestions. Every publisher on Steam sets the price for their own game in every currency. So if you're looking at our suggested price in Saudi Arabia and you just think it's bad, you don't want to sell your game at that price, you can go in and edit the Saudi Arabian price down to the penny as you see fit. So too for all the other currencies. And the second piece of the puzzle, of course, is that we often recommend people think about changing their price over time as a product ages. So if you release your game for $25, in 2018, you've got a bunch of tools at your disposal to think about. One of them is just discounting. Maybe you want to slowly stair step a discount to be deeper and deeper over time. But there's also a point at which you might say, hey, I really don't sell that many full price copies at $25 anymore. Maybe I want to be $14.99 after a few years. So if you are one of those devs who has multiple games on Steam or you released titles a while ago, repricing the back catalog titles can be meaningful, right? There's a reason we sell Portal 2 for $9.99 today. We would never have released it for $9.99 years and years ago, but as the title aged, we sort of moved it down the price range over time.
Awesome. We just got another question. I was just going to say last chance for questions, and one popped in, so that's perfect timing. Are we planning to organize offline Steam Dev Days again someday? That's a great question. That's something that we have talked about off and on throughout the year, as clearly events have been slow to be safe to do in person again. That is definitely something that is on our radar that we've been talking about internally. For us, Dev Days is all about, we talk about the end user. We care about developers and customers. And our biggest thing isn't doing a Dev Days for the sake of doing one, but rather like, do we have enough to say that we feel would be helpful to Steam developers and that we feel would be worth your time? So we are we ask ourselves that all the time and are definitely considering doing a virtual dev days. In the meantime, what we've been doing, Tom mentioned earlier, a virtual conference that we did based on communication back in April. So we've been doing, when we do have enough information that we feel is worthwhile sharing with developers, we've been doing virtual events. So we just did, so we did the one in April on communications. We just did one last week about Steam Deck. So doing virtual events in the absence of live ones is very much something that we're able to and interested in working on, as long as it's information that we feel is worth your time. Any other
Great.
questions?
I think we're about out of time.
We are. I mean, if it's not already obvious, we love hearing from you. So instead of emailing us, we've kind of moved away from email so that we have a better system set up to get you help or assistance as quickly and as easily as possible. So if you just go to Steamworks, there's a support button at the top of the main page there. And if you click that, it files a ticket and it gets in front of all of us. And then we get to decide who the best person is to answer that question. It's not like it goes to some random person at home, not sure how to answer. It goes to all of us actual people. So that's the best way to reach out to us if you have any further questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting us to join. We really hope this was useful. It's a huge pleasure getting to connect with folks, even digitally like this. Hopefully we'll be meeting with some of you in person, in real life, in 2022 and beyond.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. This was super fun for us.
Yes, thank you.